Mom, Dad, I want a starter set. Can you buy me one? What's a starter set? Mom, Dad, I want a player's handbook. Well, what's a player's handbook? I need dice. What does all that mean? Well, if you're scratching your head and your child has just discovered Dungeons and Dragons, in this video, I'm going to alleviate all of the confusion and shed some light on what your child is actually asking for. So thanks for tuning in. This is the second in a series for parents that have children that are just starting to discover and get into Dungeons and Dragons or popular role-playing games. Hi, I'm Sean. I like tabletop role-playing games. I've been doing this a long time. I even stream on this channel and talk about other tabletop role-playing games. I started out as a wee lad, and throughout the years, I've made lots of different friends, learned lots of different things, and have really enjoyed what tabletop gaming has provided, specifically role-playing games. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into some of these details and find out what it is that your child is asking you to buy them when it relates to Dungeons and Dragons. It's probably important to understand what's actually needed to play the game. Dungeons and Dragons has been around for over 50 years. Back in the days, we didn't have computers on every desk in every home, and we certainly didn't have tons of applications that sat on a mobile cell phone that we have in our pocket. Back in the day, we had to use pen, paper, and dice. So for our characters, we'd write them on a sheet of paper using our pencils, and then the dice that were all shapes and sizes and colors, we would have them at the table, and we would roll them on a table, and we would record results or convey information to the dungeon master. And if there were any changes to our character, we'd simply take out an eraser, scratch off the value that's listed on our character sheet, and change it to a different value. Nowadays, with applications, a lot of apps can do that for us. And while it's still relatively the same experience, but you'd be surprised that your young child may want to experience pen, paper, and dice, and not necessarily a digital application. So that's important to know. Now, you could buy pencils and paper and dice, and it may just do the trick. But what they're probably asking for is maybe a starter set. Or if they're not, as a parent, it may be something that you would want to know about. This is the Dungeons and Dragons starter set for the 5th edition version of D&D. Yes, there are different versions. There's actually a version that comes out after 5th edition. Some are referring to it as 2024. Some will call it 6th edition. Some will call it 5.5 edition. But it is important to know the different editions, because if your child is playing a specific game and you buy them the incorrect edition, well, they're going to be an odd duck at the table with all the rest of their friends if they've got all the latest and greatest, but your child has maybe an older version. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but it's something to be conscious of. Anyways, if you find it that it's okay, this is a great value. So in the starter set comes a set of dice, 6 of them, a D4, a D6, a D8, 10, 12, and a 20. Basically, the D prefix just stands for die or die type, and then the number is the amount of sides to each one. The other thing that comes in the starter set includes an abbreviated rules booklet. I say it's abbreviated because it has a good set of rules, but it doesn't have all of the things that a player would need for a longer term game. In other words, there may be spells and things of that nature, different rules, different traits that will be found in a player's handbook that aren't in the abbreviated rules in the starter set. And then there is a scenario that is in the starter set, or an adventure that the dungeon master can run, that is going to take the characters from level 1 to level 3. And then there's 5 pre-generated player character sheets. Pre-generated just means that instead of having to sit down and create your own character from scratch or a blank sheet, these are already done. All you have to do is fill in the name, and it has all the abilities, all the skills, all the equipment, and the background, the race, the level, and the class of the character to play. Basically, it's set up so that if you buy this, if you read the scenario, you could take one of those characters and get it to the table about as quick as possible. It's $29.99 in most retail outlets. Sometimes you can find it on discount at certain resources. It's a great value because if you buy a set of D&D dice, sometimes that can run you anywhere between $5 and $20, even more depending on what the dice are made out of. So just right there is almost half the cost of a starter set. And then, of course, with the pre-generated characters, as well as the mini scenario and the abbreviated rulebook, it is a great value to get started with Dungeons & Dragons. However, it's not the only way to get into Dungeons & Dragons. The other option is that your child may actually be asking for the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. So what's the Player's Handbook? You're probably asking. Well, there are typically 3 core books that make up the core set of rules for Dungeons & Dragons. The Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. The Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide is usually reserved for the Dungeon Master, but there are tons of players that just love combing through the monsters that are set in the fantasy world. So there's those 3 core rulebooks. So does the player or your child need all 3? Probably not. But it's something to know because once they get the Player's Handbook, they may want the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide, although keyed for the Dungeon Master, there is helpful ways to actually run a game. And frankly, your child may be interested in running a game. They're the ones that want to facilitate the Dungeon Master tasks and duties and responsibilities of presenting the world to the group of players. Please encourage them to do that. Many people and many adults even are a little intimidated by running Dungeons & Dragons. You have to orate and present to your friends, and you feel compelled to have to know every single rule. So there's a little bit of pressure, but if your child is willing to take that on, kudos to them. The Player's Handbook. Now, with Dungeons & Dragons, currently there is what's called either the 6th edition or the 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons. It came out last year, and the DM guide or the Dungeon Master Guide, as well as the Monster Manual, are now out for that newer version. So it's new, it's fresh. However, the larger population of Dungeons & Dragons fans probably reside within the previous edition, which we affectionately call 5th edition. It's the juggernaut that's out there. It's the game that, well, actual plays like Critical Role or Dimension 20 use for rules. Are they cross-compatible? There is overlapping between the two, and there's subtle differences. Now, with some gamers, it may not matter whether a person has a 5th edition Player's Handbook and then another player at the table has the 2024 edition. As long as the Dungeon Master or the group overall kind of come to a consensus on what bits and pieces they're taking from each edition. In other words, some of the changes may be rather subtle. Frankly, you as the parent, you may not know the difference. Heck, even your child may not know the difference. But it may be something to ask, especially if they're wanting a Player's Handbook and aren't specifying what specific edition. You'll want to ask them or have them check with their group. So that way, well, let's just say that if they're going to a costume party and it's thematic, let's say it's superhero themed, you certainly don't want to dress your child up in something that isn't. I want to touch on the character sheets just briefly. So in the starter set, you get 5 pre-generated characters, which is great. If your son or daughter wants to run the game quickly and wants you to pick a character without having to generate one or make one, you just pick one of those. But what if you wanted to create one, or what does all the information mean on the character sheet? Well, just think of the character sheet as everything, the traits and the skills and the abilities that make up who the character is in the game world. So for example, there's a place to put down their character name. Then of course there's a class. The class is kind of the job of that character. So some of those examples, like they could be a knight, like a fighter. Another class includes a rogue, sneaky. They can climb very well. Rogue, dashing, daring. And then there's the wizard. And of course, the wizard is the magical Gandalf. They read spells from their book and cast spells like fireball. And then there's the cleric, or a religious type of character. They follow a deity of some kind, and through the powers of their deity, they're really out to do good. They actually have healing powers. So in case some of their comrades fall victim to the sword of an enemy, they can heal that character. And then, of course, on the sheet is an area for the character's background, as well as equipment and gear. So what do they carry in the game? And all that is captured on the character sheet. Think of it as a character profile in a video game. Now, I don't want to go through page by page of what's in the player's handbook should you decide to purchase one for your child. You can actually page through them at the local game store if you'd like. They're usually not shrink wrap. You can just pick it up like you would a book in a bookstore. You could probably find it at a popular bookstore. It's all the rules. But having said that, the rules in Dungeons & Dragons aren't hard and fast. There's so many, it's hard to remember all of them. And also, it's one of the bigger reasons that some of the players are afraid to be the dungeon master, because they feel as though something will happen in the game and they won't know the rule, and they'll freeze and not know what to do in that moment. Where many good dungeon masters will just make what's called a ruling and move on, and then readdress it with the rules later after the game when there's time. Sometimes you have to find the rule when it actually comes up, or reference something when the situation occurs. Regardless, many of those details are within that book, and it's good to pull out and look through, whether you're playing a character and generating one, or if you're actually playing the game and a certain situation presents itself. Some of the other things that your son or daughter may actually ask for when they start getting into Dungeons & Dragons are dice bags. You know, in the starter set, there's a little plastic Ziploc bag that they come in. But they probably want something a little bit nicer. And you can find dice bags made out of different material, leather, cotton, cloth, different colors and different patterns on them. That's a good thing to get them, to keep their dice in one spot so they don't lose them. Because if they lose them, guess what they're going to ask for? More dice. So just tell them, keep it in your dice bag. They'll probably ask for things like miniatures, something that represents their character or a monster. Other things might be a dice tower that they put on the table and they drop their dice into to come up with something randomly. They may even ask for vinyl maps, dry erase markers, different writing utensils, whether it be dry erase markers, pencils, paper. But there isn't a ton that you really need to play Dungeons & Dragons. The starter set is really all-encompassing, minus something to write with. Hopefully this helps kind of paint that picture a little bit. And when it comes down to it, just ask them, what is it? Why are you looking for that? There's also applications that may be of use to them. Maybe it's a subscription to D&D Beyond, which is the digital tool set that Wizards of the Coast put out in order to have digital books within that space. So that way you don't have to have a physical one. In the next video, I'm going to help you visualize a little bit about what actually takes place at the D&D table in an actual game session. What's a player look like when they're playing Dungeons & Dragons? What does the Dungeon Master do playing Dungeons & Dragons? What can you expect as a parent if you're hosting your children's D&D session at your home? Or even what's happening if your child goes off to a friend's house and plays Dungeons & Dragons? What does that look like? Check it out right here. I'll tell you a little bit more as you start to engage yourself into your children's fascination with Dungeons and Dragons. Thanks. See you on the next one.